So I'd just like to open the floor to questions if anybody's got any. Yeah.
Does Angular also have hooks into databases so you can use your controller to just push stuff seamlessly?
Yeah. So on the Angular side, any database interaction, you're going to probably be working with a RESTful service of some sort. It could be any kind of API endpoint, but that's typically done through what they call a service. I didn't touch on that because that's a whole kind of topic in itself, and you're not really going to be able to cover too much in 15 minutes. But yeah, so their services are singletons that get generated, and you can inject them into controllers really easily. So you see how the scope at the top there is being injected into this controller. I could inject my API service there as well, and then use that wherever I needed to. Yeah, right here.
How was it on 96?
Yeah, not going to work too hot on IE6. You're pretty much looking at IE7 and up for most features. So does it do polling?
Like on IE, like without observables and stuff like that?
No, IE6 is basically not going to work.
Okay,
yeah.
What about IE7?
IE7, yes.
So it would pulse like every now and then?
No. So IE7 supports all of the core features for the actual framework itself. Where it falls down is around the HTML5 adding of tags and whatnot, and there are ways around that. There's polyfill that you can add to make it work nicely in IE7 still. Yeah, right here.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so the question is there a case where the data binding doesn't work very well because there's event handlers firing, that kind of thing? Yeah, definitely. So what happens with the two-way data binding is whenever there's behind the scenes there's a digest loop and an apply loop. This is kind of getting into the guts of what's happening in Angular itself. And what gets created is a watch list for all of those data bindings that you've created. And on every digest, it checks to see what's changed. It does a dirty check, and then if something's changed, it then tells that particular section to re-render itself, which can be expensive if you have a huge list of items that it's checking constantly. So if I have an interaction where I'm dragging something across the screen, for instance, and on mouse move, I'm causing this digest loop to fire off, you're going to run into some performance problems. Angular gets around that by essentially you can break out of Angular's digest loop into normal JavaScript land, let your UI update seamlessly, and then call back in to say it's time to actually do that digest loop to dirty check all of those variables again. So you can kind of short circuit it when you're running into performance problems because you're calling digest constantly. Yeah, you're not going to run into any, mainly performance, and if you're running into those performance problems, there's probably a really good way around it. Back here?
Curious about your thoughts about the relative advantages and disadvantages of Angular as opposed to some of the other front-end frameworks that we can see with Backbone and
Yeah, definitely. So I've done a bunch of stuff in Backbone, so that's probably what I'm most familiar with. And so the thing that I found, I actually do like Backbone a lot, and where Angular gives a lot more structure than Backbone does. Now that's not a good or bad thing, depending on the kind of application you're writing. Backbone may be a really, really great choice. It doesn't make a lot of decisions for you and doesn't give, it gives you basically that really, really low-level MVC style construct, and that's it. You're not getting all this extra decoration of HTML, but they really serve two different purposes. I think Angular is really about augmenting HTML and creating new tags and creating new ways of defining HTML, moving away from building applications and using JavaScript to kind of force a layout engine to show dynamic content, to making the layout engine better through using these directives. And that's really, I think, where Angular plays really nice. So I think they each have their place. And I wish I could comment on Ember. I don't have a lot of experience with it, so I'm sure somebody could better speak to that than I could.
Fair enough. We do some work in Ember, and we found that, like, I know from anecdotal experience that Angular sort of serves. We have certain anecdotal experience with Ember. Now with Angular, we generally have
Yeah, definitely. 100%, yeah, and depending on your application, it's pick the right tool for the job, definitely. Yeah. Is there a question here?
Yeah, I wonder if you had any insight or experience in using Angular apps in Sensible.
I don't actually. For things like screen readers, that type of thing. From my understanding is that these types of frameworks are going to play havoc with something like a screen reader because especially the actual HTML that gets delivered down before Angular kicks in is essentially just a template and by design. And your HTML pages are just templates for the actual application once you put that ng app in place. Then everything gets transformed by the framework itself. So, but I don't have any experience with it, so there may be a good solution there. I'm not sure. Could be, yeah. There's a question back here.
Is there just a high level, is there like a clean way, like you hook in a service and communicate with the rest, and you update the UI, the rest thing, it's like, oh, I didn't actually save. Is there a clean way to update and provide feedback?
Yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, say I push something to a REST service and it fails, right? I've already updated my local model to be the valid state that I expected because I want a responsive application, but then the call fails or what have you. So there are a couple of ways around that. One is that when you update the model, you would have to implement it yourself, essentially. On failure, something would happen. You would need that old state around to basically replace with the previous state. It's really easy. It would be easy to do. I mean, you would just make a clone of it, clone of that object. You could do a shell, depending on what you were doing. Hopefully, you have a nice shallow copy, and you can drop it back into place. But once you drop it back into place, the two-way data binding will just kick in and update your UI seamlessly for you. So you don't have any extra pain beyond replacing that old object with, or the new object with the old one. Right, yeah. Then you're looking at a stack of these objects that you need to roll back. You're looking at multi-level undo at that point, which is a problem you're going to face for a lot of applications.
What's the recommendation for things like require.js? Like, because especially even the template itself can be loaded with require.js. Is there a specific way of?
Yeah. So you can use require.js to dynamically pull in all of the Angular resources. There are hooks that you can use depending on how you want to set up those packages. So it's all available there depending on how extensive you want to use require. There's no limitations really to using that. Yeah.
Are you writing like a lot of original directives, or are you finding sources, or are they starting to merge, or libraries emerging?
There are some, but for the most part, for what I'm doing is I'm creating a lot of my own directives. For instance, a good example would be I have a reporting chart that I want to use. I would create a directive that lets me type something as simple as my report as a new tag. I've defined that and provide the data source for it, and everything just shows up and works as intended. That's kind of where we're going. I can definitely see third-party providers starting to create angularized versions of their controls. Charting libraries is a good example. It would be a perfect target for something like that. But I think those things will start to evolve over time. A good example, one that is working now is Twitter Bootstrap's all of their UI has been ported over to Angular, for instance. So that library is completely available, and the syntax is identical. So, but it plays nice with Angular in the Angular way, trademark. Is there a question over there at the back? Yeah.
I'm just wondering about Angular. I mean, is there any point anymore after when you're using Angular to have to play together?
Sorry, having which play together?
I'm wondering about jQuery.
Yeah, definitely. So the question is jQuery. How does it come into play? Is there a point to it? When you start writing your custom directives, you are essentially having to do your own DOM manipulation. So you can leverage the existing Angular tags or Angular directives within an actual directive itself. These things are completely nestable. But what it does provide is when you create a directive, they have a version of jQuery-like that gets loaded by default to give you some very basic DOM manipulation tools that are normalized for all browsers. It's generally frowned upon to utilize jQuery heavily within the Angular directives. There's probably a more Angular way to do it, but for certain stuff, if you need to be incredibly performant, you can actually break out of that Angular digest loop that I was talking about earlier and do something completely custom. Another great example is I have an existing piece of code that I want to bring into an Angular app that's written heavily in jQuery, and Angular lets me do that really simply. I can wrap that as a directive, tying it into my main system, but it delegates to jQuery behind the scenes to create that particular piece of user interface, wizardry, whatever you have previously defined.